Welcome everyone and suddenly it's cold again, but we are here for another reason. We are here to go over the tier list of melee DPS. We looked at the healers and then the tanks and then the ranged DPS. So now it's time to go and take a look at how the melee DPS have been doing in this patch so far. Now we have gotten enough weeks with 2 legendaries, enough weeks with most people, I hope, the ones who kept up with it, many people with 4 pieces of your tier set. So now you can see the full power of each spec in display. All that's left now pretty much is just growing in item level a little bit more. So much like we did for the ranged DPS, we are going to first take a look at how is the situation damage wise, purely about their DPS and how the specs have been performing. Starting with, since we started with AoE and Mythic Plus for the ranged DPS today, for the melee DPS we are starting with the single target damage first. So this is the single target damage that the top logs of each spec is averaging on the most single target fight in the raid, which is Skolex. So this time around, for the average single target DPS, we are starting with the absolute state of the specs at the bottom, instead of starting from the top. Because at the bottom we immediately have, I would say, 3 outliers in terms of single target performance. You have 5 seconds to try to guess the 3 worst melee DPS specs in single target. And the time is out. So, the 3 specs currently doing the worst in single target are Outlaw Rogue, Windwalker Monk, and Arms Warrior. These are the 3 specs performing the worst on a pure single target fight in the raid. Now, Arms and Outlaw are not particularly popular right now, but what comes after them is a couple of specs that are, if you will, flavor of the month for this tier, at the very least for the start, because we have Survival Hunter and Frost Death Knight. These 2 specs are also quite known for not having their single target damage as their strongest point. They are much more powerful in doing AoE, in burst damage as well, in AoE, not as much in single target. As we start getting closer to the middle of the pack, we see Assassination Rogue, Fury Warrior, and Ret Paladin, gapping them a little bit more higher up. This is quite interesting because Assassination was usually and traditionally one of the better and higher performing single target DPS specs, so instead to see them in the bottom half of the results for now is quite interesting at the very least. Not as interesting to see Fury here. They're not as specialized in single target nowadays. They are much better in consistent AoE. Now, as we are getting in the top 5 of melee DPS specs, the one in 5th place, barely actually edging Ret Paladin, was Havoc Demon Hunter. They have over the course of this expansion definitely improved their single target, and they have gotten better and better. They have never been quite the strongest, but definitely better than what they were known for before, which was just a ton of AoE and not much single target. In the top 4, we see next Feral Druid. Unlike Assassination, which was known for their single target, and this time around they are not doing as well, Feral Druid was known for its single target and it is still doing quite well in single target damage. However, it is still not quite in the podium, in the top 3 of single target damage for melee specs, because in the 3rd place of the podium we see Unholy. This is quite surprising. Unholy was not very considered at the start of this patch. If anything, more of the spotlight for Death Knight went on Frost DK for DPS specs, but it is actually, especially once they got their tier pieces, their set bonuses, it is Unholy that shows up to have a more consistent and stronger single target damage. They are still a little bit gapped, a little bit further down than the top 2. In 1st place, there is a much larger difference than pretty much all of the other spots, all of the other ranks we have seen so far, because while Subtlety is 2nd at 15,500 DPS, Enhancement is 1st at 16,400 DPS. They are currently the better performing in single target damage. They are also, when we go by simulations and we don't go by the actual results, even the simulations actually are telling us that Enhancement should have the highest single target DPS. Not just of all the melee, but actually of all the other DPS specs. So at the very least, in one thing, the sim is correct, which is the performance of enhancement so far. Now, many things might heavily vary when we start looking at AoE DPS. Of course, this time around, to properly check the AoE, we have to go and look at Mythic Plus. We have to take keys where AoE is plentiful, so just like the Ranged DPS, we are looking at Halls of Atonement. The average key level is 23, a plus 23 level of Halls of Atonement, and these are the results of the average top DPS of each spec. At the bottom, almost intelligible, we have Assassination Rogue. That is also not a surprise. Much like Assassination was known for their single target, they were also known for having abysmal AoE. They are at 11,300 AoE DPS. Following them, and we are getting a little bit more in the surprise range, because following them is Outlaw with 12,000 DPS. Now, Outlaw was known for their AoE. Perhaps not as much of their burst, but their consistent AoE they were able to dish out, and now they turn out to be one of the worst ones. That is definitely quite a large change compared to what they were used to. What is not a change, however, are the positions of Arms and Feral Druid. They were also specs not particularly known and not particularly powerful in their AoE category, and here as well they are still pretty low as far as AoE is concerned. We start getting a little bit towards the middle of the pack with Ret and Unholy. This is quite surprising. We live in a bizarro world where Unholy is much better performing in single target now than it is in their AoE. So now they're not doing as nearly as well as, once again, what Unholy was known for their AoE burst. After that, we have a significant jump from the 13,000 DPS of Unholy with enhancement, and above them an even larger jump to the 16,300 of Havoc Demon Hunter. They are, I would say, in the spot they deserve. Perhaps you were expecting more AoE coming out of Havoc. They certainly had periods in the meta where they were higher in AoE damage. Nowadays, not as much, but they're still doing plenty fine in AoE. It is still a fine situation for them. Who gets it even better are the next two specs outside of the podium, Subtlety Rogue and Fury Warrior. Both of them are edging a significant gap past Havoc. Havoc was at 16,300, and then Subtlety is all the way up to 18,600, barely a couple hundred DPS below Fury. Both of these specs have quite some consistent AoE. They are not known for massive burst windows to line up. They are just very stable in their AoE damage, but as I said, they are still outside of the podium. The three specs at the podium, with of course the outlier right at the top. We have seen this before, talking about the two nerfed specs we will see in the reset coming up. The one at the top is obviously Survival Hunter, followed by Frost, Death Knight and Windwalker Monk. So, we will have to see eventually how much of this nerf is going to impact the AoE damage of Survival, but for the moment they have been the more clear-cut, better performing AoE spec of Melee DPS. Also worth mentioning, it comes to not much of a surprise that Frost, Death Knight and Windwalker are, as usual, known for having much better AoE damage than they can with their single target. With the two results side by side, both in their single target and AoE situations, we can see that actually, unlike the Ranged DPS that had quite some spec being decent in both, we were mentioning Elemental, Demonology, Frost Mage, even Fire Mage, were doing kind of okay in both. In the Melee DPS we have much more of an up and down, much more of a definite strength and clear weakness. Because if you look at the top damage of AoE, you look at Survival, Frost, Death Knight, Windwalker, and they are all towards the bottom in single target. In single target you have Enhancement, Subtlety, Unholy and Feral. And then in AoE, Unholy and Feral are towards the bottom half. The only two clear, I guess, consistent specs are Enhancement a little bit, and more consistently Subtlety Rogue. Those are two of the specs that have been more consistent between the two types of damage. Most of the other specs are much more shaky in where they are strong in the type of damage. This right here is how the specs have performed throughout this tier, throughout this patch. You can see that some of the specs have continued their performance over time, like Arms Warrior still being just plain bad, or even Windwalker Monk not really growing that much. Other specs have went slightly down, like survival. They have settled down a little bit more. We do see currently a quite interesting growth of Unholy Death Knight. You can see they started all the way towards the bottom, and over time, week by week, they have made their way up much more compared to before. Enhancement, Shaman and Havoc Demon Hunter also have been growing over time. Slowly but surely they are now towards the top as well. Now, as a quick blitz through each of the spec and what's going on with them, one of the revelations of this patch, Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman is definitely more popular than before in Raid Encounters and Mythic Plus. Not as much as the other specs, it's still not one of the top considered specs overall, but it's definitely a dream compared to the state Enhancement was in before. They are switching, they are splitting time between Nightfey in Raid Encounters for their Spirit Wolves cooldown and Necrolord for their Lavalash playstyle in Mythic Plus. Their damage profile is quite burst-centric, but not as much as other specs. They have a very long uptime of their Feral Spirits anyways, so it's not what you should think of when you think about burst. They have more consistent damage overall than many other specs. Another spec whose definition of damage would be unfair to call burst is Frost Death Knight, because their damage profile is essentially tied. Once again, Frost is a spec that is kept hostage by Breath of Sindragosa. As you can see here, the teal color is Breath, so that's where their damage spikes come in. Whenever they can keep Breath going, that's where their damage lies. As you can see, because of how long it is, it's not really burst. I guess it's a long burst for Frost Death Knight in the way they do damage, and then they have quite the depressing downtime when they don't have Breath up. Their damage is very low in single target. They are still not that popular, despite growing and easily passing Unholy, especially in Mythic Plus. They are still not even in the top 6 of considered specs in Mythic Plus. They do a little bit better. They are considered a little bit more in the raid, actually. The interesting part for Death Knight for Frost is that while they can still play Necro while going for their Abomination's Frenzy Legendary and either Biting Cold or Rage of the Frozen Champion, depending on Mythic Plus or Raid Encounters, they are actually moving a little bit more towards Nightfey. The final meme that Death Knight players feared, which was turning into a fairy with little sparkly wings, now actually more and more Frost Death Knights are going for it. Talking about damage profiles and talking about something different than what we have seen so far is Havoc's, because Havoc is a very consistent type of damage. They don't have burst. Yes, you might have AoE in mind, you might have Mythic Plus pulls in mind, but when it comes to raiding, their damage is very consistent, mostly because they don't really have any strong cooldowns. You know, when your biggest cooldown is Metamorphosis and you can keep Metamorphosis up for this long, that's how consistent your damage is going to be. Also, as you can see, when Metamorphosis is not active, it only gets activated for a brief moment. Because of Demonic, that's how low it goes. But besides that, their damage is much more consistent nowadays in single target. Yes, it doesn't mean the spec itself is still enjoyable to play. You're still using just a handful of buttons without too much thinking, but at the very least your performance in single target has increased compared to the joke that it was in Season 1. Talking about types of damage and unique things, Subtlety is another one of the special types of damage, because as you can see, Subtlety's damage is too spiky to be called consistent, but at the same time those spikes are not high enough to be called a bursty playstyle. The reason why is, of course, they have a middle ground between the two, because their cooldown essentially revolves around Shadow Dance, which is available very often. That is gonna be the entire resolution of their damage profile. Tons of tiny little spikes whenever they enter Shadow Dance. That is how Subtlety Rogue operates. What is also interesting about Subtlety and the other Rogue specs pretty much is that they are now more willing to go Kyrian. Subtlety is still staying Venti Mythic Plus with their Obedience Legendary, but in Raid Encounters with the new build around Akari's Soul Fragments, they are now going for Echoing Reprimand and their Kyrian Covenant ability. That is a change compared to what we saw last patch as far as Subtlety goes. We can finish this damage profiles outlook with two of the very true burst specs, because one is Unholy. As you can see, that is a proper burst damage type of build, And of course, the reddish color you see there is Army of the Dead. That is when the unholy DPS spike is gonna come in, and also thanks to their tier set, now they have a little bit more consistent pet damage compared to the damage they were doing before. They are much more pet-centric. They're not quite Demonology Warlock level yet, but they're getting there over time. Another type of burst-centric spec, of course, has remained, not really much change here, has remained Windwalker Monk. Windwalker is still very centered around their Storm, Earth and Fire and their cycle of abilities to be squeezed into that window, which continues to do very good AoE damage, but not as much as we have seen, not as much single target damage. So, given what we have seen, given what the situation has been for the damage that these specs have shown to us, this tier, I would say we would have to make a tier list starting from the bottom. These three have been the worst performing so far in all types of PvE content: Arms, Outlaw and Assassination. In a tier above we have Ret and Feral Druid. Both of them have not really been too performing. You have some hope for Feral in single target in the raid, but that's about it, and it's not enough to go up one tier, because in that tier, in the tier above, is Unholy and Windwalker. Windwalker is much more useful in Mythic Plus. They have found more of a niche there. Unholy, we have to see more of them. We have seen they are growing, we have seen they are doing more damage. They have now a more consistent single target damage. Their AoE is still not as bad as a spec like Feral, for example, so they deserve to be a tier above. Once you have done with these first 7 specs, we have the top 6 of the melee DPS. I would say into the B tier, the more even and hard-fought tier, we have Fury, Survival and Havoc. They are not there for the same reason. In the case of Fury and Survival, they have much better AoE than they have single target, and in the case of Havoc, they are more, at this point, a jack of all trades. Their single target has gotten much better, but their AoE has gotten worse, so now they are not the best at anything, but they are very consistent in what they do, so they are still in a very good situation. I wouldn't complain too much about the state of Havoc right now. In the podium, in the top 3, we have Frost and Enhancement in 3rd and 2nd place. Frost has essentially one of the strongest AoE damage in Mythic Plus. They are quite weaker, however, in the raid. It is a glaring weakness to put them this high, despite being so average in the raid. But still, the raid is not all about single target. The raid is still going to have quite some windows where 2 target, 3 target, 4 target, or flat out AoE damage windows are going to be useful, and that's where Frost Death Knight is still very powerful anyways. So with that and their current power in Mythic Plus, I think their placement is currently deserved, followed by Enhancement. Enhancement has one of the strongest single target damage profiles in the game, plus they're still doing respectable AoE damage and cleave, sustained cleave. They're not as dependent on burst damage and burst windows, so they are overall a very balanced and well-rounded spec. And into the S tier, a spec that was predicted to be in the S tier a while ago, even probably the last tier as well. They have continued to be very good, which is Subtlety Rogue. They are essentially a Havoc, but better, because much like Havoc, they are quite good in both situations, but a little bit more than Havoc. They have a little bit more single target damage, actually quite more single target damage than Havoc, and they have also more AoE overall than Havoc. So in general, they plan out to be better overall compared to the other specs that we have seen so far for melee DPS. Of course, there is sadness for the state of some of the specs at the bottom that have fallen down quite a bit, but you know, if there are some specs at the top, there must be some specs at the bottom as well, and this is what we have for 9.2, the current situation of melee DPS specs so far. With this being said and done, we have now finished our review, almost couple of months of this patch. This was the meta state and situation of all of the roles in the game. So with this being presented to you, I'm gonna leave you to the rest of your Tuesday and reset day, and soon to be reset day in EU. Thank you guys for watching the video and for helping to grow the channel. You can do more by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel. But this time around, I'm gonna pull a surprise card, because instead of letting every melee DPS subscribe to the channel, thanks to this video, we are going for the opposite. No melee DPS is going to be allowed to subscribe for today, unfortunately. Thank you guys once again. You can also find me, of course, on Twitter and support me on Patreon as well if you really have bad decision making. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I always hate it. I hate it when I go to sleep, I wake up, but it's too early, so I have to try to sleep again, and then I can't fall asleep.